Hello! For those who don't know me, my name is Kat, and in this video I'm going to go through all of the 43 books that I read in 2024. My friend Nadia actually asked me to go through all the books that I read last year and review them. She also loves to read and always recommends the most interesting books. So yeah, there's 43 books that I read last year, and I think by far that is the most amount of books I've read in a single year in my entire life, and I completely attribute it to getting a library card. It definitely helped me read more, I think purely because I had a deadline I had to read the book in. I was more motivated to read and finish it by that deadline, especially if I liked the books, which some of them I definitely did not. I think last year I read some of the best books I've ever read, and also some of the absolute worst. So let's jump in. All right, so the first book I read last year was Silverthorn by Raymond E. Feist. It's actually the second in his Magician trilogy, which is the original trilogy he wrote. I read Magician in 2023 at the recommendation of my boyfriend because it's one of his favorite books and it is amazing. So I read that in 2023 and then started off the year reading Silverthorn, and then the third book in the series, A Darkness at Sethanon. I hadn't read fantasy for like probably 12 years. I used to be really big into it when I was younger, and that was all I'd read, but in my kind of like late adolescent, early adulthood, I've definitely steered more into the sci-fi territory. But this series is amazing. It's by far some of the best fiction I've read. Raymond E. Feist has written like 50 other novels. It's ridiculous how many he has, and they're all set in the same kind of universe, and they all build off characters that are introduced like in previous series. The storylines are really, really interesting. The characters are really well developed. In some sections, I will admit, it was a bit slow, but I think that's just the nature of it being like a fantasy series from, I don't even know when this was first published, like the 90s? The 80s, early 80s. So yeah, I think that is probably why the pacing is slightly slower than I guess we would be used to. But highly, highly recommend the series, even if you just read Magician. Next on the list is The Great Zoo of China by Matthew Reilly. I personally have a love-hate relationship with Matthew Reilly. I think his writing reads like he's just describing what he's like watching in a movie. It's very base level, and very much action adventure. You really have to suspend your disbelief for his books, because while they're set in reality, it draws on elements from like Greek mythology. In this case, it was like Chinese mythology, and yeah, kind of integrates it into real life, but not in a very cohesive way. Not say like the Percy Jackson series, which does it really, really well. This is kind of more like you really have to suspend your disbelief to believe what's going on. But basically the premise is that there is a zoo in China, and if you can't tell from the cover, it has dragons in it. Yeah, it's just, it was a palate cleanser for me after the Raymond D. Feist novels. Next on the list is probably one of the greatest books I've ever read, Never Let Me Go by, I'm gonna butcher this, so I'm so sorry, Kazuo Ishiguro. This was completely not what I expected. I bought it years ago because I love the cover, although it's starting to like wear off a little bit. Love the cover art. And thought, you know, it'll be a like pretty easy read, and it was. It's like diary entries from one of the characters, Kathy. And it's about her and her two friends, and it's kind of set in this dystopian future of the UK where clones are made of people and they're harvested for their organs. But it's more of a love story and kind of like a coming of age, figuring out your place in the world story. You kind of have to uncover the sci-fi elements of it. And I just thought it was like a romance coming of age story. So it was really surprising and really beautiful. One of the best books I've ever read. All right, next on the list is The Cleaner by Mark Dawson. Not gonna lie, kind of hated this. I read it because I wanted just like a quick action adventure story. I didn't really get into the whole mystery part of it. Wouldn't recommend. I'm probably gonna donate this. I thought I already had, and then I found it in the stack behind me, so there you go. Next up is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I don't watch horror, like cannot do horror at all. I can do like psychological thrillers like Silence of the Lambs, but I would never watch The Exorcist or like Annabelle or any of that. But I love reading well-written horror. I haven't seen the series, but the series is not the same plot as the book. It's set after the events of the book, but super easy read, really, really quick, very tense. I think it's really hard in books, especially horror and thrillers, to build a genuine sense of like dread and eeriness in your reader, because you don't have all those things that I guess movies and films do, where you can build it with the lighting and the music and just the way the characters are interacting with each other physically. But Shirley Jackson does an amazing job, and yeah, by far one of the best books I read last year as well. The next book I read, one of my co-workers lent it to me. It's The Seven Moons of Maali, Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. I've butchered that again, I'm so sorry. So the story is based in Sri Lanka, and it follows I think a war journalist, and he dies, and he is kind of stuck in this purgatory limbo and has to kind of figure out who killed him and why. Really, really interesting style of writing. It was written in second person, which genuinely took me a really long time to get into. It probably took me like 3/4 of the way through the book before I kind of got into a bit of a rhythm with it. So I feel like that was the downfall for me. I think if it was written in first person or third person, it would have been a lot easier for me to get into, and probably I would have appreciated it more. But beautiful, beautiful writing, very visceral and kind of emotive, I would say. So recommend that one as well. The next book I read was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. And I haven't read any of the others in the series, but they're definitely on my list. And I just thought that this was so, so beautiful. It is set in a coffee shop and follows, I think it's 4 different people. Yeah, 4 different people, and them going back in time to interact with a loved one or a family member or something. And it's translated from Japanese, so it's a little bit disjointed in sections, but I don't think it detracts from the story at all. It's really, really easy to read, and just it just kind of leaves you with a sense of contentment, I would say. So highly recommend. The next book I read was 537 Days of Winter by David Knoff. This was amazing. I really enjoy reading non-fiction, but this was the first one I read in 2024. So David Knoff is an Australian Antarctic expedition leader, and he was stuck in Antarctica during the pandemic. So basically they signed up for their winter expedition, which is, I think it's a year. And then while they were down there, the pandemic hit. So it meant that they weren't able to get back to the mainland, so back to Australia. And essentially their stay in Antarctica was extended indefinitely. So he ended up spending close to 2 years down there, 537 days. And it's just a really compelling story about resilience and coming together to face challenges and overcome them, but also seeing the beauty in life. He's got some beautiful photos in there as well that he took from his time there. But yeah, and it's just a really interesting insight into life in Antarctica, because who actually ever gets to experience that, really? So yeah, also recommend, very easy read. The next book I read is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I've also probably butchered that, so apologies to any French people watching this. I bought this book years ago, like probably 2015 or 2016, and just had never got around to reading it. And then I watched the movie, the Netflix movie, when that came out a few years ago, and enjoyed it. And then finally decided to pick up the novel. It is really good. I'll say that. It's not the best kind of love story I've ever read. Love story mystery, I would say. But yeah, it's really, really well written. It was written in the 30s, I believe. Yeah, published in 1938. And you can very much tell that it is of that time. Particularly, I would say, by the actions and narration of the main character. Honestly, it got like halfway through the book and I was like, this character is really shitting me off. She needs to like grow some balls, get some agency, and just make some decisions for herself. But I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it is emblematic of the time it was written and how a female would be expected to perform at that time. Really kind of interesting mystery to it, which is all revealed at the end. I would read it again for the mystery, honestly. The love story not really for me, but yeah, the mystery was good. Another palate cleanser after Rebecca, I read The Three Secret Cities by Matthew Reilly. But yeah, The Three Secret Cities is just another classic Matthew Reilly action adventure. And yeah, it was just a palate cleanser after Rebecca. All right. Oh. The next two books I read, I have read before, and I read because I was rewatching the series Conversations with Friends, so I thought I'd read the book as well. I don't know if this is like contentious or anything, but Conversations with Friends is my favorite Sally Rooney novel. I think it's her first novel, and I just think it's so much better than Normal People, and I can't articulate why I like it so much better, but I also read Normal People again. I feel like Conversations with Friends is just so much more believable, and to me the characters feel much more rounded, whereas I think Normal People, the two main characters, they're almost like caricatures of what you expect them to be. I'm not really challenged in how I perceive them, if that makes sense. Whereas I think Conversations with Friends really presents some challenging characters, which you don't necessarily like, but just raises some interesting issues and opinions. So yeah, if you haven't read these, highly recommend them. I tried to read Sally Rooney's other book, what is it? The one about beauty? I can't remember the name of it, but could not get into it. I think I read like 20 pages and I was like, that isn't all for me. Okay, another book that I didn't really love, Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. I was surprised at how much critical acclaim this got and how little I enjoyed it. I think it was trying to be something it wasn't. It was trying to make these analogies to Fates and Furies of Greek mythology and just falling so short, I thought. It's broken up into 2 parts and follows a male and a female who end up together, and so the first part is told from his perspective and the second part is told from her perspective, and you kind of learn the secrets in their marriage and how their secrets impact their relationship with each other. And I think it almost would have been better if the 2 parts were switched, so you got the female's perspective first and then the male's, because I found that the male's perspective was just so naive, and I actually like really disliked him, and not in a way where I disliked him and could appreciate his character as a dislikable character. I just really disliked him. His part is like 2/3 of the book and her part is 1/3, and I wish her part was expanded more, because I feel like the things that she did before meeting the man was so much more interesting and there was so much more there to explore. I wanted to like it, but I just don't. One book I really did love though is Feel Free by Zadie Smith. This is a collection of her essays, and I think that her writing is just it's so beautiful without being too much. I think she has a really interesting way of looking at the world and communicating how she sees it in a way that is so accessible, and yet emotive and challenging, and yeah, it's just a really interesting perspective of the world. So highly recommend. Again, a very easy read, and I haven't read anything else by Zadie Smith, but I think I'm going to borrow some of her other books from the library. The next book I read was The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. I'd read a few of her other books, The Hunting Party and The Guest List, which are kind of like locked room mystery thrillers. This is still a mystery thriller, but it's set in a Paris apartment or a Paris apartment block. I remember reading it when it first came out and enjoying it, but I think upon second read, knowing where it was going, it wasn't as good. I think because I knew what was going to happen, I could see all the plot points that she was setting up, and they were just too obvious for me. If you haven't read it though, give it a crack. In some aspects it's a little bit almost too basic of a mystery, although there are a couple of good twists. I'm kind of contradicting myself here, I'm sorry. The Paris Apartment, would recommend. The next 3 books that I read were all by Jon Ronson, and they were lent to me by one of my work colleagues. So I read The Psychopath Test, Adventures with Extremists, and Out of the Ordinary, True Tales of Everyday Craziness. So all non-fiction. Jon Ronson is, I think, a British journalist, and he kind of looks at people who are kind of like, I guess, not marginalized by society, but have extremist ideals and views, and kind of integrates himself into their life and explores how they see and perceive the world. I think my favorite of the 3 was The Psychopath Test. It was a really insightful look into what it means to be a psychopath and how they're presented in media, and what that means for people who actually are psychopaths. The Adventures with Extremists was really interesting. That was where he like actually went and integrated himself with like families and groups who were extremists. And then True Tales of Everyday Craziness is just like the weird shit that people do. And how they kind of like justify it to themselves. Really enjoy his writing and would recommend. They were all quite short books, very easy to read. The next book I read was Other People's Houses by Kelli Hawkins. So I originally bought this book, I think when it first came out back in like 2021. Yeah, 2021. And I bought it because Kelli Hawkins actually lives near the city that I currently live in. So I thought, support a local author. And it's just kind of like a mystery drama set in Sydney. Kind of the same with The Paris Apartment. I enjoyed it the first time I read it, which was when I first bought it. But upon second reading, it kind of relies too heavily on a lot of highly used tropes, like the main character is an alcoholic and lost her husband and son and is projecting that onto other people. And it was just fine. If you're after like just a light mystery drama, recommend. The next book I read, I actually didn't read it all. I started it and then skipped to the end to read what happened. So it was Milkman by Anna Burns. And I bought this when it first came out because it won the Man Booker Prize in 2018. And I thought, oh, it must be good. And oh my goodness, I hated it. It's written in stream of consciousness, first person perspective. None of the characters have names. They're all referred to as like second son or girlfriend or brother. So it's so hard to actually get an understanding about the characters and who they are and what they do. It's set in an unnamed city, but it's set in Ireland during the war there. It's an interesting idea for a story, I'll say that. I just think it was executed really, really poorly, which sucks because I really wanted to like this book, but yeah, just wouldn't recommend. Alright, the next book I read after Milkman was Deep Work by Cal Newport. I think I was in a bit of a slump because I read Deep Work and then I read Atomic Habits by James Clear. Both are like super, super easy reads and both contain like pretty decent practical tips. As a general rule, I'm not really a fan of self-help books because I think they try and exploit our deepest insecurities and weaknesses, but I do like self-help books that actually give you tips and tools and the ability to put what they are saying into action. They're not just spouting words. The next book that I read was probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite book of the year. So if you know me, you know how much I love Formula One. And my boyfriend got Adrian Newey's memoir, How to Build a Car. And it's quite hefty. Like it's a decently sized book. I think it's like 370 pages. And it's like not large writing. So my boyfriend got this book and then started it, but didn't really keep reading it. So I was like, oh, maybe I can read it while you are not. And yeah, I think I read it in like a week. It's so fascinating. I love learning about everything that goes into making something, whether it's, a Formula One car or even just like, I don't know, bread or something. Like I like knowing the inner workings of things. So this was a really, really cool insight into both Adrian Newey's life as a Formula One car designer and also into the sport of F1, because obviously it's highly stylized in the Netflix series and you don't really get an in-depth look into the workings of the team and stuff just by watching the races. It's got some really, really beautiful illustrations in it, which Adrian Newey drew. schematics and blueprints, and yeah, it's really, really interesting. And also really interesting his career trajectory and how he actually got into the industry. So if you have like any sort of engineering or just interest in general in motorsports, I would highly recommend. So the next book I didn't actually read. I listened to the audiobook of it because I was running a lot and I wanted something different from podcasts and music. It's called Ultra Processed People, Why Do We Eat All the Stuff That Isn't Food and Why Can't We Stop? And it's by Chris Van Tolken, who is a British scientist. Oh no, he's a doctor, sorry. I think he's a GP. It's narrated by him as well, so beautiful British accent, love. And he explores food and the impact it has on our bodies, but then the fact that we're consuming so much stuff that isn't actually food, it's just like chemical compounds, and what that means for our health, our genetics, our DNA, our children. It's super, super interesting. I think I would like to get a physical copy of the book and reread it, because I think I would retain a lot more of the information as opposed to hearing it. That's why I don't really listen to audiobooks. But yeah, he referenced some really interesting studies that had been done. It was really well researched, I thought, and really well narrated. So if you get a chance to listen to it or read it, I would highly recommend. All right, the next book I read was Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie, which I borrowed from the library. It's the first in a trilogy. I haven't read the other books. I'm not sure if I will, to be honest. But it's a science fiction novel set in space and follows this artificial intelligence named Breck. It was really interesting to read because the AI had multiple bodies. It was like in control of a spaceship, and it was really interesting to like look at, I guess, humanity from that perspective. Yeah, it was a really interesting sci-fi adventure, action adventure kind of thing. I didn't love it. I felt the pacing was kind of off. I felt almost like it was trying to be Star Wars and take you to all these different planets and regions and meet all these interesting characters, and it just felt a little bit disjointed. But that being said, I thought it was a really great premise for a story. It won the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, the BSFA Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and the Locus Award for Best First Novel. And so it's the only novel ever to have won the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Awards, which is like phenomenal. So I think I went into it knowing all this, and I feel like my expectations were probably a little bit too high. That being said, I would recommend reading it. It was a very easy read. I think her writing is really interesting, and the way she presents this AI in a way that I guess we as humans can actually understand it. Yeah, would recommend. So the next book I read was Caliban's War, which is the second novel in the Expanse series. So I read and I own the first book, Leviathan Wakes, and I read that in 2023, I think. Yeah, so it's a sci-fi series set in space. So the Earth has colonized Mars and this thing called the Belt, which is just like an asteroid belt. And it's just kind of like an alien proto-molecule has been found and is being used as essentially like a bioweapon, and it sets off this whole string of events that is like the basis for this 9-book series. So I'm slowly getting through it. I'm up to book 6. So I read Caliban's War, I read Abaddon's Gate, Sibylla, Burn, and Nemesis Games last year. So I read 4 of those books last year and thoroughly enjoyed them all. I think I have watched the first series of The Expanse on Amazon and also loved it. I feel like it's really just flown under the radar, but it's stellar. It's like amazing acting, amazing effects, like CGI is through the roof. But the book series is great. I think it doesn't overreach, which I like. It's very much a logical progression of events that would happen if the events of the first book actually happened, if that makes sense. It's written by James S.A. Corey, which is a pen name for Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. And one of them, I can't remember who, is actually the assistant to George R.R. Martin. But yeah, really, really enjoy them. One of my favorite things about them actually is that each chapter is told from the perspective of a different character. So the first book follows a captain of a spaceship and a detective, and so it switches each chapter between them, and gradually their stories like intertwine. And so then throughout the series, the captain of the spaceship, his name's James Holden, he is always one of the chapters, or one of the characters that has chapters in the books. And then depending on the story, you get like 3 or maybe 4 extra characters that you hear the story from their perspective, which I think is really refreshing and a really cool way of introducing new characters without it getting boring, just being told from the one person's perspective. So yeah, would highly, highly recommend the series. I'm really looking forward to kind of finding out what happens. So I've got 6, 7, 8, 9. I've got 4 books left. So that'll be this year's job. The next book I read, I also got from the library. It's called Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention by Joan Hari. I liked this book. I think it was a really good analysis of where we are as a society and how much technology, and especially social media, how much control it has over us, which is ironic given I'm filming a YouTube video right now. I think its downfall though is that it kind of, the book assumes that everyone kind of has the capacity to disconnect. Like Deep Work and Atomic Habits, you've got to take these sort of books with a grain of salt. Would recommend. It brings up some really interesting and challenging topics. The next book I read, I think it's the worst book I've ever read in my entire life. I would not give it to my worst enemy to read. So it's 101 Essays That Will Change the Way You Think by Brianna Wiest. I borrowed it from the library because I thought, you know what, I'll give it a go. I've seen it online. I've like read decent things, but it was terrible. For starters, it's not even essays that she's writing. It's just like listicles. It's like BuzzFeed listicles. Like none of the essays actually have any genuine substance to it. There's no like practical advice. There's no like challenging concepts that make you reflect on like yourself. That's all I'll say on the matter. The next book I read is Sociopath, a memoir by Patrick Gagne, and it was recommended to me by my friend Nadia, and it was so interesting. By far one of the most like interesting memoirs I've read, I think purely because it's written by a sociopath and she's like clinically diagnosed. It's not just like her going, oh, I'm a sociopath. No, like she is legitimately a sociopath. And I thought it was really, really interesting because as a quote unquote normal person, or like what we as a society deem as normal, it was really fascinating to be able to kind of see things from a really, really different perspective, but also gain an understanding for what it was like to be in the mind of someone who like doesn't have any emotions and doesn't have like any kind of impulse control. The only downfall for me in the book was that it kind of felt like she was repeating the same mistakes, or like repeating the same, I feel like plotline is the wrong word, but like she kind of went through the same rhythms with like the relationships she had with people. And while I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because I think it's just emblematic of her being a sociopath, like her inability to like learn right from wrong or like build an emotional relationship with someone. I think in the book it just dragged a little bit. But yeah, that's just my personal opinion. I think it's a really, really, really interesting book. It's quite short, it's very easy to read. She's a very good writer, and yeah, would highly, highly recommend. The next book I read was The Three-Body Problem by Lu Cixin. I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm so sorry. It was really, really cool. It was really, really interesting. It took me a little while to get into it because it's translated from Mandarin into English. Yeah, really, really cool sci-fi premise. I watched the TV series after I read the book, of the Netflix TV series, not the original Chinese series. I think they did a pretty decent job of adapting the book, but it's a great book, would recommend. I don't know if I'll read the others purely because I find them so dense, and it's just a lot to read while I'm also reading another series that's like really heavy sci-fi. So maybe after I finish the Expanse series, I'll come back to the Three-Body Problem series. Next book I read was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. I read this book at least once every year. It's my favorite book of all time and probably my favorite author of all time, Gillian Flynn. If you haven't read it or watched the movie, go and do one or the other. The movie is excellent, but yeah, the book is something else. It's just, you always get so much more detail in books, but this is like even better. And that being said, I did love the movie. I thought they did a really, really good job with it. But yeah, this is by far my favorite book. I think the whole setup in the first part to give you like a certain idea of how you should be perceiving these characters is really, really well done. I think I'm trying not to spoil it if you haven't read the book, because I think everyone should read this book. I think you could look at it from the view of, you know, social media is all about the highlight reel, right? Like people only see what what you want them to see, but also what they want to see. They don't want to see the bad stuff that's happening. I think it's a really interesting and challenging concept that she presents, because we think we know people, but really we don't. And I think this is like the extreme version of what could happen. But I think people would do well to think about how well they actually know their spouse, or how well they think they know their friends, and create space for them to actually be who they want to be, and be able to express themselves in a non-judgmental way and feel supported and loved regardless, and not expect people to be this idea that you have for them, and if they don't meet that, then they're not good enough for you. But yeah, read Gone Girl. The next book I read was Tony and Susan by Austen Wright, published in 1993. Follows two characters, Susan and Edward, who were married but now split, and Edward sends Susan the manuscript for his novel, and Susan reads it. So you're reading this book while she's also reading this manuscript, so you get to read the manuscript as well. And it's quite harrowing. I don't think it's classified as like a horror, but I think it has elements of that genre for sure. It's very eerie and dark. It's quite short. I think it's only like 200 pages. A very, very easy read. Very good at building the suspense and the tension. Yeah, would recommend. The next book I read, or kind of read, I wanted to love so badly. Like, but I couldn't do it. So it's the Book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves and China Mayville. The concept, the premise for the story is so interesting. The premise is that there's this soldier, well, now soldier, this guy that just can't die, and kind of his life through the ages leading up to present day, where he's a soldier for some sort of like US Army division or whatever. Yeah, so the premise is really interesting, but it's just so prose heavy. I feel like every second word I was having to look up. And I'm pretty well read, but this was just something else. It was like overly descriptive, overly poetic, and not in a way that added to the story. I think it would have been so much better if it just wasn't written how it was. I know that sounds so bad, but I would love to read the story and explore what it means to be immortal through the ages and deal with that loneliness and sense of loss and grief and never growing old but seeing everyone else around you die. Yeah, I just couldn't do it. I really wanted to love it. Like, I really wanted to be able to read it and love it and think about it and what it meant, but I ended up skim reading it. I think I've really tried to read the first 50, 70 pages, and I just went, I can't do it. And I needed the validation as well that it wasn't just me, so I went online and everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people were also in the same boat as me, so that kind of felt a little bit good. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's just too much. It had everything going for it. Amazing premise, but just really fell short, and I'm really disappointed. The next two books I read are both by Reilly Sager. So I read Middle of the Night and The House Across the Lake, and I guess kind of similar style to The Paris Apartment. They're just kind of mystery thriller, although there's a little bit of supernatural elements in there as well, and I'm I don't know how I feel about this. Can we just do a mystery thriller drama thing? Kind of, I would say it's a cross between Matthew Reilly and Lucy Foley. It doesn't lack depth, I would say, but it's also the characters aren't challenging. They're very much tropes, I would say. Pretty cool mysteries though, kept me guessing. I did figure it out at the end of each book though, before the big reveal. I think there was sufficient amount of red herrings thrown that it kept me interested in the story. Probably wouldn't read again, but I don't know, if you're looking for a light mystery thriller, yeah, Reilly Sager. The next book I read wasn't actually a book, it's a short story by Stephen King. It's called The Monkey, and I don't know how I stumbled across this. I think it might have been on a Reddit thread or something about short stories you should read, and yeah, it was really good. I mean, I thoroughly enjoy Stephen King's writing regardless. It was very eerie and tense, and I'm so glad I do not own and have never owned one of those clapping cymbal monkeys, because I would be throwing it out straight after I finished that. Terrifying. Would recommend. It's great. Would recommend any of Stephen King, honestly. Next book I read is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I love this book. I think it's so honest and raw and real. I really enjoy her writing. I think she does a really good job at not rationalizing, but explaining why things were the way they were and just why it made sense to her at that time, and then coming to terms with that later in life and kind of challenging the beliefs that were ingrained into her in childhood. Highly recommend. The next book I picked up from the staff picks section of the library. It's The Night in Question by Susan Fletcher, and it's about a 70-year-old woman who has one leg, she's in a wheelchair, and a death happens at the retirement home she lives at, and it kind of throws into action this reflection of her life, and it's told through the stories of her loves, so the people she's loved, and it's just so beautifully written and it's so heartwarming, and I think it really showcases the fact that old people weren't always old, you know, like, I mean, obviously we know that, but they have so many stories and they've lived so much life. They've got so much to teach us. We just need to stop and ask and listen. I really, really loved it. It was, yeah, just beautiful. I would highly, highly recommend. And the last book I read for the year, number 43, was The Bullet That Missed by Richard Osman. So this is the third book in the Thursday Murder Club series. I've been meaning to read the third and the fourth book for ages. I have the first and second and just had never got around to reading the third and fourth. And I loved it. I love, love, love Richard Osman's writing. He's so witty and funny and dry and just, yeah, it's great. It's about 4 elderly folk who live in a retirement village. I think it's in Kent in the UK, and like a lot of murders happen around their little village, and they kind of come together every Thursday as the Thursday Murder Club and try and solve these murders, and it's just a lot of fun. And again, similar to The Night in Question, reinforces the fact that, you know, old people weren't always old. They have a lot of life experience. They have a lot they can teach us. We just have to ask questions and listen. So yeah, would highly recommend anything by Richard Osman. I'm really excited to read his other book, We Solve Murders. I've got it on hold at the library, except I'm number like 71 in the queue, so I may be waiting a little while. But yeah, really excited to read anything that he puts out. So that is it. That is all 43 books that I read this year. I hope you enjoyed that. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments what you're reading, what your favorite books are. I always am open to more suggestions and recommendations, and wherever you are, I hope that you have a lovely day.